Welcome to TechnoViews podcasts, a new series of online interviews with major figures in the humanities and social sciences on topics at the intersection between technology, society, and culture. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Hong Kong. The subject of today's podcast is China's environmental crisis. Our guest today is Professor Stevan Harrell, a major figure in China's environmental studies. Hi, Steve. Welcome to TechnoViews.
Good morning, Gonzalo. I'm glad to be here.
Let me introduce you before we start.
Okay.
Stevan Harrell is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Washington. Steve is one of the most well-known anthropologists of China. He has been doing empirical research in China and Taiwan for more than 4 decades. He has published many books and his research interests are broad, including family, kinship, fertility, aging, and gender, as well as religion and ethnicity. In the late 80s and 90s, Steve started doing fieldwork with ethnic minority communities in Sichuan province. Work in Liangshan, Sichuan led Steve to develop a strong interest in environmental sustainability and community development. His focus on environment is strongly interdisciplinary and reflects his position at the University of Washington in between the Department of Anthropology, China Studies, and Environmental and Forest Sciences. He's writing a new book that seeks to rewrite the history of modern and contemporary China from an ecological perspective. And that's why we're here today in Seattle to talk about China's environmental crisis. I mean, it's a big subject in the international media. Everybody is talking in one way or another about environmental issues in China. I mean, the most images that we get on television are mostly images of industrial pollution. I mean, in large part, of course, because China has been going through a large-scale process of industrialization in the last few decades. But of course, this industrial pollution is not the only thing about the current environmental crisis. This crisis has historical roots, and I know that you've been writing a little bit about those historical roots. Could you tell us a little bit about that, Steve?
Yeah, quite a bit. I've gone back basically to the beginning of the Qing Dynasty in the mid-1600s.
In the mid-1600s. And so what did you find?
Well, I think this is a time when China entered a period of really accelerated growth. There obviously were a lot of environmental changes in old civilization, an intensive agricultural civilization. And so, for example, we know that lots of species disappeared that were known all over China 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Elephants. Well, elephants and agriculture don't mix very well. Tigers and deforestation don't mix very well. So these are old things. But the 1600s are really the beginning of a intensive population explosion, which sets in motion the environmental degradation.
So how does it connect? Population growth, environmental degradation. What are the linkages? What kinds of changes took place to allow that population growth in the 1600s onwards?
Well, I think to allow it to grow, there were two things. One was they imported crops from the New World. They imported corn and potatoes and sweet potatoes. And those have high productivity and they're adaptable to places where traditional crops such as rice and wheat and millet and sorghum don't adapt very well. So that's one thing. They allow to expand farming through agricultural innovation. The other thing is that the Qing really brought peace to the country and peace and prosperity and disallowed population growth.
I see. In addition to population growth, what other factors come into play in the making of China's environmental crisis in the Qing Dynasty?
Well, I think the Qing was too good. The Qing administration, in a sense, was too good at regulating the environment. By which I mean they established such a time of peace and prosperity beginning in the late 1600s that they allowed the population to grow really fast. And in order to do this, they set up a system of infrastructure maintenance because it requires a lot of irrigation infrastructure, a lot of flood control infrastructure, a lot of transportation infrastructure. And on the other hand, they set up a system of efficient governance and distribution and storage of food so that if there were a natural disaster, there was a flood or there was a drought, they had ways of providing relief grain. They had ways of providing seed grain to farmers. They had ways of taking care of refugees. That allowed, again, the population to grow at that time.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit more about the time span of these transformations. I mean, how long was there an intensification? I mean, you mentioned the 1600s as a turning point, but what is the time span of this population growth and these transformations in patterns of environmental exploitation?
Well, of course, to one extent, it's still going on. It's 350 years later. But the crucial time span is probably from the 1600s through the 1800s, because during that period the population tripled. About 150 million when the dynasty was founded in 1644. And it was at least 400 million, maybe 450 million in the mid-1800s. So that's a lot of people for the environment to absorb without putting too much pressure on agricultural resources, by which I mean land and water and labor and animals and forests and all of these resources that go together to support people's livelihood.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, wild animals like the elephants and tigers as some kind of, markers of environmental transformation. Were there still elephants and tigers in the 1800s in China?
There are still wild elephants in China, in a tiny part of the very southern part of Yunnan in the southwest. There's still a few tigers, not very many, and most of those are in the north. But there's a very interesting recorded history in the Qing Dynasty, because there's a progression that goes on in any particular place with regard to tigers. First, there's no attacks on people. The tigers are in the forest is vast, and people and tigers don't have any encounters. Then there's a period at which there are all sorts of so-called man-eating tigers. They come and they attack people. And this is the period in which the people are expanding agriculture, they're cutting down the forest, they're logging, they're building roads, and the tigers are feeling more and more constricted in their habitat, and they attack humans. And then there's a period when there's no more attacks because there are no more tigers. And so this has been used, Bob Marks, an environmental historian, as a kind of an index of how much of the environment is being intensively used by humans, and how little or a shrinking amount is sort of there as an ecological reserve that produces clean water and wood and forest resources and prevents erosion and so forth.
Mm-hmm. What was the extent of environmental degradation during the Qing Dynasty? I mean, you've talked about, you used metaphors of intensification. You talked about population growth. You've talked about reduction of, biodiversity using wild animals like the elephant and tiger as indicators. But what was the extent of environmental degradation? Did it affect economic sustainability, for example?
Eventually it did. I mean, that's two questions, right?
Yeah.
The first is the extent is probably best measured by the degree of deforestation. The best estimates is about a quarter of the area of China was covered by forests in the 1600s. And it's down to between 10 and 15% in the early 1900s, and may have even gone lower after that. So about half the forest in China was converted to agricultural land. But of course, when you convert forest to agricultural land, it doesn't stay necessarily as agricultural land, particularly if it's in the mountains, because the soil can erode. The eroded soil is no good for farming, and you get a kind of a wasteland. And then the soil that comes down and goes into the rivers. Sometimes the rivers change course because there's so much silt. Can't get boats up there anymore. In terms of the geographic extent, it's practically everywhere. But there are places, for example, well-endowed places in South China that didn't experience as much degradation or as much deforestation. In North China, it was almost complete. In the early 20th century, provinces of Hebei, Shandong, and Henan, in the heart of the North China agricultural area, they have as little as 2% of the land is covered by forests.
I see. Yes. And what about economic sustainability? I mean, one of the major factors, I suppose, in the drive to expand of the the Qing Dynasty government is, of course, this moral economy of provision, to provide food for the people, right? So, to what extent did environmental degradation affect this capacity to provide food for the people?
Oh, it affected it a lot. For example, there are a lot of places where irrigation systems can no longer be maintained with the level of agricultural expansion. And in the area of the Central Plain, it's called the Jianghan Plain, which is now in Hubei province, around the big city of Wuhan, and upriver from there. There are areas where agriculture was no longer sustainable because they couldn't control the floods. And so they converted from agriculture to fish ponds, which of course can provide protein, but they don't really provide the calories necessary for the population.
Mm-hmm. Well, that surely must have posed a predicament to the Chinese government, and at the moment in which, new political forces were emerging, new players, Western imperial powers as well, were present in China towards the late 19th century, more strongly. And how was that predicament resolved? I mean, which ways did Chinese political reformers found to develop new ways of providing food for the people?
That's a really interesting question, because in the early 20th century, political reformers of all stripes, both more conventional conservative and the radical communists, began putting a kind of faith in science and technology, often science and technology that they saw as imported from the quote, scientifically advanced Western countries. And so they looked toward engineering, and of course China has a long tradition of environmental engineering, but they looked toward quantitative science and engineering as a way of being able to intensify production by building more infrastructure, by introducing higher yielding varieties of crops, eventually, not until the PRC, introducing chemical fertilizer, and always looking toward these kind of scientific solutions of intensification, without necessarily taking into consideration the idea that the environment sets its own limits for itself, and that human ingenuity is not necessarily capable of overcoming the limits that are naturally there in the environment.
I see. I suppose that Chairman Mao is a good source of idioms to kind of capture certain transformations, certainly in political ideology of environmental governance. I mean, I'm kind of thinking now, his Ren Ding Cheng Tian, right? So humans must conquer heaven. Is that what it's related? I mean, is this related to the change that you were talking about? This invoking engineering sciences and quantitative methods?
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't the first. There's a plaque on the coast of Taiwan, which of course was never ruled by the communists. It has that slogan, Rending Shengtian, where they built some kind of coastal infrastructure seawall. But I think that the communists, with their particular Marxist philosophy of development, and I want to make it clear that the Marxists from the beginning were interested in development. I think there's this mistaken impression that it's kind of a trope that you get in the press that, well, they were interested in revolution until Deng Xiaoping's reforms, and then they were interested in development. No. They were interested in revolution as a means of development, both social development, but also economic and physical development. That's one of the big reasons why revolution. And they tended to turn toward a kind of idea that the key to prosperity is the organization of labor, organization of human labor. You're going to reorganize it. Labor will no longer serve landlords or serve exploiting classes or serve capitalists, but it will serve the people. And in this kind of context, they don't seem to really recognize, again, the idea that there are limits that the environment itself sets on exactly what humans can do to it.
Mm-hmm. Were communist ideologies of environmental governance in China modernist, in the sense, say, that someone like James Scott, for example, gives to the term modernism? I mean, were they part of a larger modernist revolution
Oh,
going
absolutely,
on around that period?
absolutely. I think that communism and capitalism in the 20th century are varieties of developmental modernist ideology. And if you can re-engineer society, which of course is what the communists are trying to do, the revolution, in order to make it more stable, in order to make it more just, in order to make it more prosperous, if you can also re-engineer the natural environment in the same way. There's a quote from Chairman Mao that he gave sometime in the early 1940s, saying that it's the same way that we use social science, by which he meant Marxism, Leninism, to reform society. We also use natural science to reform the environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the communists took power, they were very much almost worshippers of natural science, quantitative science, and applying this kind of science to increasing production and also to stabilizing the environment, because they, along with everybody else, realized that the environment was necessarily in bad shape.
Are there any good studies of the impact of these new modernist ideologies on
Well, of course,
environmental degradation?
Judy Shapiro's book, Mao's War Against Nature, has become a kind of a classic. It's interesting that when she first wrote that book, she gave some talks in various places about the book, and there was a lot of resistance from Marxist environmental historians who had basically developed their whole discipline along the lines of what ruins the environment is capitalist greed and the pursuit of profit. And so socialists had an alternative. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there's some writings in China, particularly in the Cultural Revolution, that explicitly say we don't have environmental problems in China. This is at a time when there's belching smokestacks and oil fields all over the place, and pulling down mountains in order to mine various kinds of ore. We don't have any environmental problems. We're not motivated by capitalist greed. We're motivated by improving the livelihoods of the working people. And in such a condition, environmental exploitation or environmental degradation is impossible. And this was an ideology that was widely promoted in China during Mao's time.
But you are convinced that environmental degradation has intensified under Mao, and so the question is, in which ways the pattern of environmental degradation was intensified when compared to the previous cycle of development, say in the late imperial period that you were talking about earlier?
Well, I think there's two things. One is that, of course, there's an explicit push toward a large-scale push toward industrialization. Mm-hmm. Now, this isn't the first push toward industrialization. The Qing Dynasty at the end was interested in particularly building railroads and armaments and this kind of industry. And then, of course, we have the industry in the Republican period, particularly light industry, textiles, and so forth. But the real push toward a kind of Soviet-style massive steel and railroads and trucks and trains and cement and all these big heavy industrial things, this really comes during Mao's time. And this adds the factor of pollution to the factor of environmental degradation that was there previously. So but I also think there's something else. The second factor, which is that under Mao, there was this idea of no limits to human ingenuity. Mm-hmm. In fact, in the Great Leap Forward, 1958, there's a very famous slogan, 人有多大胆，地有多大产. That is to say, as big as the courage of the humanity is, that so big will be the produce of the earth. In other words, the only limit on productivity, agricultural or industrial, is human ingenuity and human courage. There's no natural limits. Mm-hmm. So during the earlier periods, there was a real recognition that humanity and nature ought to be in harmony. Mm-hmm. But that kind of goes out the window And it comes back to the slogan that you asked in your question, the slogan about people are destined to conquer the environment.
Yes, I mean, I suppose it's a common theme throughout the global industrial revolution, Prometheus unbound, right? That's the whole idea that human beings are, human ingenuity has no limits. We
Yes.
can overcome all kinds of problems. I suppose you are suggesting then that the Maoist period, in a way, is the most immediate precursor to the current environmental crisis. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so in two ways. One is the emphasis on growth, which is always there, and the other is the emphasis on, or the actual, just the physical industrial route toward growth.
Yeah. Are you in? I mean, you are an anthropologist, so you've been doing field work in China for many decades now. And have you encountered, directly in your fieldwork experiences, situations of local populations engaging in various forms of environmental protest?
Directly, not so much. I mean, I know it's very common, and we talk about that, but there's certainly one that I can think about. The population that I work on in the Liangshan Cool Mountains in southern Sichuan is an agricultural population, actually agro-pastoral, also forestry, and living at fairly low density. But there was a scheme to build a dam in one of the valleys in order to provide water for nearby towns. And the people in the village actually got out and blocked the bulldozers that were taking the rocks, the rock fill that was being used for the dam, because it was hurting their agricultural lands.
So what time period are you talking about now?
This was about 2013 or 14.
Is there any evidence of environmental protest in China in the Maoist period?
No, not that I know of.
I mean, earlier than the Reform period. And if not, why? I mean, I suppose it may seem a naive question, but I think it's an interesting question to ask. I mean,
Well, I think one thing was it was in many ways a repressive regime, and in other words, you protested. It was great danger to protest. But I also think at the same time that they, at least until the Cultural Revolution, that the communists instilled in people a kind of spirit of sacrifice. And this idea that we sacrifice ourselves for the country. And a lot of people who, in areas that were infected, for example, with environmental diseases, places that were, for example, mining or very dirty smeltering industries and so forth, and lung diseases and so forth. We hear about cancer villages. A lot of these cancer villages go back to that period. And people were expected to suck it up. Grin and bear it, and if you make a sacrifice for the revolution, that's glorious. And so both a kind of a faith in where things were going, at least until the Cultural Revolution, and also the real danger and lack of tolerance of protest, both of the things put together. Of course, what it may be is that we just don't know enough yet. And if we did enough oral histories in enough places, then we might be able to find some.
Well, some people also talk about some kind of mind shift, whereby only under certain conditions there emerges something we could call environmental awareness, so to speak. So in a way, we could say the argument could be made that perhaps during the Reform period, China's society has been going through some kind of process of environmentalization, whereby the theme of the environment and the environment as a trope becomes a routine of everyday life. And this can be seen, for example, in situations of conflict, right? Whereby formal conflict, I mean, whereby people in one way or another get organized and formalize mechanisms of protest, and in some cases petition. What are the current patterns of environmental protest in rural China?
Well, I think almost entirely, in terms of protest, it's almost entirely spontaneous, and it's almost entirely in reaction to um, visible or palpable pollution of the air or water or soil, and to disease outbreaks of diseases that seem to be connected to environmental pollution, whether it's air pollution or whether it's, for example, lung disease from working in the mines or from chemical discharges which affect the water supply, either the agricultural or the household water supply. And there seem to be spontaneous protests. People get fed up, and they try all sorts of things. They try sending petitions to the local government office. Every county in China has a petitions office. And you can take petitions, or you can show up at the door and you can show up with a complaint. So a lot of local, just very spontaneous protests of that sort. But there's also more direct action. A factory which had polluted the water supply, well, then people would block the factory. Folks that I knew blocked the bulldozers that were taking away their important land and demanded compensation for it. So that's one aspect of the pattern. The other aspect of the pattern is that they almost always, well, one more thing is that the regime seems to be tolerant of these protests as long as they stay local. And they're directed at specific grievances, whether they're medical or otherwise. The other pattern is that they're almost always settled by compensation. They're settled by monetary compensation. It's much more common for villagers to be awarded a certain amount of money in compensation for a pollution than it is to actually get the pollution stopped. So people are bought off. And local governments are very willing to buy people off because higher level governments partly rate the performance of local officials on their ability to prevent disturbances, protests, or to solve them when they come about.
Is society strong enough to circumvent state constraints when it comes to environmental protest?
No. It's strong enough to gain some kinds of compensation, and is sometimes strong enough to gain attention to the problem at hand. To stop the pollution is easier, of course, than actually cleaning up pollution that's already there. But I don't think it's strong enough to stop state policy. At the same time, of course, the state is being environmentalized, to use your word.
Yeah.
And this is something we can talk about too.
So could you tell us a little bit more about that? How is the state being environmentalized?
Well, they've given up the silly idea that socialism doesn't pollute the environment. They know absolutely that they have got many very polluted cities in terms of the air. They've got polluted rivers, lakes. Many lakes are turning green with this blue-green algae, and it kind of looks like kind of green paint. If you go to Dinch, the lake right next to the city of Kunming, all around the shore areas is green. I was there a couple summers ago. I haven't been to Lake Tai recently, which is outside Wuxi, just inland from Shanghai, but same thing. You see pictures. I remember visiting Lake Tai in 1985, and it was bright blue, and it was full of these old fishing boats with the brown sails, and they were catching stuff. And now it's just one mass of blue-green algae, and so that these things are obvious, and they affect the legitimacy of the government. A lot of people are turning their, just ordinary people, both rural people directly affected by some of these, but urban people are also affected by fears of food security, fears of dirty water, and then air pollution that they're breathing. You see these pictures of people going around with these surgical masks. And so the government realized it's got to do something just in order to maintain its political legitimacy. But there's another thing, which is the government is, those people are actually concerned about the environment, right? We don't want to look at them as, just because they're a communist party and they do a lot of things, we don't want to look at them as absolute cynics. right? They're not only concerned with staying in power. They really do believe that they should be able to bring a better life to people. And part of a better life is not to have to breathe the dirty air and eat pesticide-laced food and drink contaminated water. So,
and what kinds of institutional frameworks the government is setting up to kind of counter, reverse, perhaps attenuate the negative effects of environmental degradation?
Well, it's actually been gradually building since the 1990s. There have been environmental protection bureaus. They're very, very small, and a county might have one or two people back in the 80s, but they're growing and growing. And the State Environmental Protection Administration unified these things in the late 1990s. And in the last 8 years, I think, it's been elevated to a ministry status. So you have a Ministry of the Environment, which is co-equal with other ministries. Local officials are every time, if you're a local bureaucrat of some sort, you're evaluated by your superiors, and you have a set of conditions that you have to meet. Well, recently, environment has been included in that, and if you have environmental pollution, that's a check against your record. If you clean up an environmental problem that was there previously, then that's a positive mark. So there's incentive for local officials to promote this. Law is very important. China has in terms of environmental codes, they're very strict. Now, there's a question of whether they're actually complied with, to what degree. But a lot of environmental lawyers, they look at the Chinese code and they say, well, this is great. This is a great set of environmental regulations.
Does the government, the central government, tolerate environmental activists? Does it encourage the work of environmental activists?
No. The central government, as far as I can tell in China, is afraid of any kind of non-governmental organization. Now, of course, there are capitalist firms, but they are not only closely connected to bureaucrats, but those bureaucrats are often charged with corruption and so forth. But I don't think that the government has ever brought itself to the idea of being comfortable with the idea that there are autonomous sort of civil society organizations above a very local level.
So are environmental NGOs in China supervised by the government?
Yeah, and there are two kinds. There are the local ones. And the local ones, originally, they had to actually be connected with a government research institute. And so the first environmental NGO in China, which was established in the 90s, was called Friends of the Earth. Friends of Nature, sorry, 自然之友. And it was established as a branch of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is a government research, Chinese Academy of Sciences, it's a government research institution.
So this is a national scale NGO. Yeah.
Well, it's sort of. It's mostly a few people in Beijing, and there are other people. There's active people in Kunming, for example, the Center for Biodiversity and Indigenous Knowledge in Kunming, where they've done a lot of really important work recording indigenous knowledge of both Han farmers and also minority peoples. And but most of what they can do is educational. Educational, and in fact, environmental education is required in Chinese primary and secondary schools. It's very rote. It's sort of memorizing things out of books, and there hasn't been much practical application of this. But one of the interesting things is that there are people who have established environmental schools in Yunnan and other places in Beijing. And my friend Robert Eford has written about this, that they take children and instead of doing what they do in school, which is they just memorize some environmental slogans or something out of books, they take them out into nature for a day. Let's collect plants, let's collect bugs, let's show how the ecology works. And urban middle class parents are more and more interested because they have their environmental worries and they also want to do best for their children. So they're more and more interested in getting their children into various kinds of private environmental education. So education is probably the area in which environmental NGOs have the biggest latitude.
What about local level organizations? Any environmental activism going on at
Sure, I mean, we talked
beyond
about these
protests,
protests,
beyond reactive?
but no, there are often people form, friends of such and such an environment, local. There was a famous environmentalist around again Lake Tai, lake which one of the lakes which is so eutrophied, there's so much blue-green algae, and he formed an organization, and it was quite effective. But then the officials got nervous and they arrested him on some, maybe it was a trumped-up charge, I'm not sure, or some law that was not ordinarily used, because they were worried about building an alternative local base of political support.
Hmm. You mentioned earlier that many urban folks are now also, I mean, obviously concerned with environment. It's a concern that is affecting the whole of the population across social strata, regions, and so on. But quite often, urban folks are stewards of environmental activism in the country. And is there evidence of new synergies being formed between rural and urban
Yeah, I think
people?
there's a lot that, and it derives on one level from urban populations getting more and more educated, um, but also there are great fears among urban populations in China about food safety and food security, and they're particularly concerned because agriculture since the 19 well, starting in the 1970s, but particularly since the 1990s, agriculture depended more and more on the use of agricultural chemicals, well, fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides. And so they don't want their children, in particular, to be eating this chemical-laced food. And so there's a growing movement toward organic agriculture. But the problem is that people are mistrustful of strangers in general. So they go to the market and something's labeled organic. Well, that's just fake. They're just labeling it organic. You can go online. You can go on Taobao and you can buy a set of 500 organic stickers for 30 kwai, and then you can go put those on your food. So the organic certification system exists, but people don't trust it. Well, either this is a fake certification or it actually came from the right environmental bureau, but they paid off the bureau in order to give them this environmental certification. And so there's been some direct connection between organic farmers and urban middle class people worried about food safety.
Mm-hmm.
And the organic farmers are one case that I know really well in the area around the big city of Chengdu in western China is there's a group of farmers who decided that the direction that agriculture was becoming commercialized, sort of went against their idea of a kind of connection to the earth. And a lot of them were devout Buddhists. And so they started organic farming. They didn't bother to go get state certification. Buddhists, they became vegetarians. And then they started inviting urban people to come out to their farm. And they started CSA, Community Supported Agriculture, where you subscribe. And then every week they make deliveries and they bring you a basket of organic stuff. But very interestingly, you can't just sign up. You got to go there, and you got to spend a day at the farm watching how they do it, and you have a vegetarian meal with them, and then you can sign up for this CSA. And that actually got hooked up with a local environmental organization called Chengdu Urban Rivers Association, CURA in English. And it was started by a coalition of local environmental activists and environmental studies scientists from Sichuan University and Sichuan Agricultural University. And what they were concerned was that the overuse of agricultural chemicals was polluting and degrading the urban water supply. So they're trying to convince farmers to use fewer chemicals in order to clean up the water supply of the city. Well, this went together with this group of farmers who were promoting organic food for religious reasons and ethical reasons, and with the anxious middle class urban consumers who wanted the food to be safe. So there's a kind of synergy, and in fact it works.
Yeah.
You can get clean food this way.
Yeah. I think, one of the most interesting things about what we've been calling environmentalization here of Chinese society is not just that, different kinds of people are brought together under the, under the same banner. In this case, it's the issue of environment and so on. But also there's the global dimension, and which I think is very important to talk about. And it's, in my impression, is that it's not so often addressed in discussions about the current environmental crisis. China is expanding globally. It's not just about, I mean, the scope of development is no longer within national boundaries. It's a global project. And of course, with this expansion, China is generating all kinds of environmental problems in different parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Africa, and so on.
Yeah, Russia.
Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Is there awareness in China of these kinds of issues? Is there awareness that environmental activists in China are addressing the environmental problems from a global perspective and developing global connections in the process?
Well, I think that that may be just beginning, but I don't think it's particularly well hooked together yet. By which I mean global environmental NGOs, particularly conservation NGOs, have been active in China since the 1990s or even earlier. The Worldwide Fund for Nature, used to be called World Wildlife Fund, was, of course, they have the panda as their symbol, and they did a lot of environmental work together with environmental scientists in Sichuan on preserving panda habitat and breeding and sort of endangered species work. And they have other, as so many of these world environmental organizations have, there's these iconic animals, the giant panda, the golden monkey, the Tibetan antelope, and so forth in China. And it's also the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International. They've also been very active in working together with local officials and scientists to try to preserve habitat for various species that are of worldwide interest. So that's an important connection. And of course, the international NGOs in China. What this does is it seems to because the Chinese regime, and I think most of the populace of China, is very concerned with being respected internationally. They still feel that Europeans and particularly Americans look down on them, and Japanese. And so one of the things that when you read what we started out this interview with, the idea that China's environmental crisis, and the New York Times has all these things about, you can't breathe the air, and wherever it is, you can't breathe the air today. And so this is a way of China getting international respect for its efforts. The other way, of course, is by joining all these various international forums. They began at the Rio Environmental Summit in 1992, and they played a big part in the 2015 Paris Accords on stopping global warming. So the Chinese government still feels it doesn't have the respect around the world in any way that it really ought to have. And one of the ways they can do this is by engaging in international cooperation. But at the same time, if you come back to what you said about China exporting its environmental danger, I'm not personally familiar with a lot of the critique of this within China, although certainly you see it outside. The forests, China's forest has increased. I talked about the level was only about 8 to 11% of the country was forested in 1958. Now it's 21%, and there's a big reforestation effort. Well, one of the reasons they can do this is because they can import logs from Siberia. They can import hardwoods from Southeast Asia, even from Africa, even places like Gabon, which is on the west coast of Africa. They're getting hardwood logs from there. So they're also beginning to export some of their industrial pollution to poorer countries. Although I think it's still true that wealthier countries are exporting more of industrial pollution to China than China is exporting. But as it cleans up its environment, it will take a lot of its environmentally dirty activities, whether it's massive deforestation or whether it's polluting industries, and they will do them elsewhere. Not to speak of the fact that they're looking for resources all over the world. They're looking for oil. They're looking for minerals. They're even looking for farmland. And of course, they're importing enormous amounts of soybeans from Brazil and increasingly from Argentina to feed their growing pig population, as the Chinese diet contains more and more meat. So there are all of these problems.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of the internal critique, which is not to say it doesn't exist. I haven't got to that part of my book yet. So.
Okay, Steve, I think we're running out of time, but I still have a question. I mean, it's sort of directly related to what we've been talking about, and which is that there's like an increasing sense, I think, in the international community. I mean, especially within the scientific community, that environmental degradation is causing climate change in one way or another. I mean, even Donald Trump has admitted it.
Yeah, right.
Recently. And this has led many of us to start talking about a new geological age. I mean, the Anthropocene, right? The age of humans, which is meant to to refer to the fact that somehow humanity and its human activities in the last, especially I suppose in the last 200 years of the Industrial Revolution, has been significant enough to alter environmental processes and accelerate degradation. So I suppose the question I want to ask is, has this paradigm shift of the Anthropocene? I mean, in some countries, people are trying to introduce the Anthropocene in high school curriculum, for example, to kind of change the mindset of the younger generations. Is there evidence that the paradigm shift involved in these discussions around the Anthropocene, is affecting China's studies? Are China's studies people talking about the Anthropocene at all?
There's a few. Yeah, there's a few. And I'm connected with a group that has held a couple of workshops. Had one in Berlin, had one in Beijing, and maybe having one in Berkeley next year. If it's in Berkeley, I might even go, close by. And to think about this question in regard to the fact of the impact that China's economic growth has had on the world environment, both, of course, in terms of the exporting of environmental negativity, as I talked about, but also in terms of their contribution to climate change, which is now the greatest of any nation, although it's still only about half per capita. It's still only about half the contribution to climate change of North America. It was a quarter, 10 years ago. So it's growing, and ours is going down just a little bit. But I think that this is a beginning. I haven't seen it mainstream in Chinese studies. I think as people who live in China, who are interested in this kind of thing, and who are literate in Chinese and literate in Chinese culture, are beginning to talk about this, both locally and worldwide. But in terms of mainstream China studies, they're interested, but it's not a hot topic. It's not a hot topic like migration, which of course is connected. It's not a hot topic like women's rights. It's not a hot topic like ethnic repression. I think it will be within a few years, because more and more people are becoming aware of it. But mainly, it's mainly environmental historians who are talking about the past, or it's natural scientists. And there are a few environmental social scientists, a lot of people doing environmental policy and politics. But it hasn't come together around the Anthropocene yet. But it will. I think it's coming soon.
Many thanks, Steve, for sharing your thoughts on the roots of China's current environmental challenges. I am sure that our listeners will appreciate the insights of your profound interdisciplinary reflections. Your research is quite unique in its capacity to bring together the findings of different fields of scholarship, including history, China studies, anthropology, and environmental studies. Many thanks once again for sharing your ideas. You just listened to a TechnoViews podcast with Stevan Harrell, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Washington.